Okay, so good afternoon. Welcome to the Telecoms Academy Insight webinar. Today's topic is the Internet of Things, and we're going to take a quick look at trends and technologies. There's a lot to say about IoT. As I'm sure you're aware, any discussion these days of 5G and such like tend to talk about IoT to a greater or lesser degree. The focus of today's presentation really is going to be on, I think, defining what IoT is, say one or two things about the technologies, and then really discuss what the market looks like in respect of IoT. And I think the final slide, the summary I'm going to look at here is, how do we make money out of it? What's the monetization factors in creating a business out of IoT? A lot of the trends that we look at, I mean, because the main trend that we look at is, various people like Cisco and Ericsson have made predictions about the number of connected devices that there will be in just a few years' time. And, the numbers are terrific, really, 50 billion connected things. But I mean, the main question still is how do we make a business out of it? How do we generate revenue from that? And of course, there's a lot to play for here. And we've got to get a lot of things right in the IoT market if it is to be a sustainable and a revenue generating business. And we'll touch on a few of those points as we go through. We've only got 30 minutes or so to kind of cover all of these topics, so it's a bit of a stretch really to fit all of this in. But we'll do our best, and there'll be questions that you can ask towards the end of this presentation. So just a couple of introductions first of all. For those of you that are not aware of us or who we are the Telecoms Academy. We provide quite a large breadth of training really, and we break ourselves down into kind of three separate schools. There's a School of Telecoms Management, which tend to deal with management, innovation, leadership, marketing type training courses. School of Advanced Communications, which is more to do with, I guess, with the deeper technology. So we'll do LTE, LTE radio planning, IoT radio access. Those kind of programs, and pretty much everything that we deliver from a classroom or an instructor-led perspective, we can also offer that on a distance learning basis or a correspondence basis. And with respect to the correspondence or the distance learning and some of the management programs that we do, we've got a tie-up with Derby University, and we can offer university accredited programs as well. And if you're interested in what we do, I mean, there's some contact details here. There's an email address and a telephone number here to contact the sales team, and pretty much anything we can do on a classroom basis. We can do it live on web, so similar to the session that we're running today. So, and the programs that we run as well can be offered either on a public basis, or we offer a degree of customization as well. So if there's a series of topics that you're interested in which don't kind of fit into the standard public program, we're quite flexible in terms of your customer specific programs that we can put together as well. But go and have a look at our website, and you'll get a much better impression of what it is that we do and what we can offer. We should also say as well that we've got as part of the organisation we work for, we have access to the Ovum research. So a lot of the information that I'm presenting today really come from the Ovum analysts in respect of the IoT market. So there's a product, if you like, that comes from Ovum, the Knowledge Centre. Which is quite a useful thing to gain access to. Again, I'll kind of put some links up towards the end so you can gain access to all of this kind of stuff. But let's get on with today's topic. So I'll say we're going to try and make a definition of IoT initially. So of course the Internet of Things, and perhaps well, I think as a piece of terminology or a bit of jargon, Internet of Things is probably the contemporary phrase that we use to talk about connected devices and gadgets and so on, but it's a little bit deeper, or perhaps a little bit more complicated than that, because what we can consider here is that there's really two parts to IoT. There is on the consumer end and the enterprise end, and we've also got here, machine to machine versus IoT. I mean, what's the difference between the two things really? I think today. The device connectivity, so non-smartphone device connectivity, would probably refer to still as being machine to machine. That has a slightly different a slightly different flavor about it compared to what we might mean by IoT. So we might be looking at sort of embedded connectivity, perhaps on the consumer side for IoT, and then maybe we'll try and do things like fleet mapping, fleet tracking, asset tracking, smart grids, smart metering, those kind of things on the enterprise side. There's some very sort of general things, and we'll drill into this in a little bit more detail on the next slide, but we can say on the consumer IoT or the machine-to-machine side, we might be looking at LAN attached, so local area network type of attachments. There is a massive potential here on the consumer side. So, of the, 50 billion things that might be connected at some point, we're probably mostly referring here to the consumer side. Um, so there's a lot of aspirations here in respect of, how do we build a service-based model? How do we drive revenue through a service-based model on that side? However, I think the current analysis seems to suggest that the primary revenues really are driven through hardware sales, so the sales of the chipsets, the devices, the end user devices, and so on. And that might be, it may be like a one-off payment. It's not really for paid for connections or service-based models, perhaps on that side. But there is scope for movement in there if we can create a business environment where there is the potential to create a subscription-based models and so on. Perhaps that kind of model, that kind of paid for subscription, the B2B, the B2B2C, so of course business to business or business to business to consumer. Perhaps that's more on the enterprise side at the moment. An enterprise might be more concerned with sort of large scale data collection, and I think that opens itself up, at least for now, more readily to service-based models or paid for type connections. Perhaps that market is not as big as the potential consumer market might be, but I think in whichever market we're reaching for, whatever sector we're reaching for, really, validating that relevance within the market. I mean, maybe this is from a CSP or a telco perspective. That's a big question that we've got to answer here. What's our position in the value chain? What part do we play? What service can we bring to the overall value chain? And that's something we'll explore a little bit later on in this session. But we can drill into this a little bit further. I mean, the diagram has a couple of sectors in it here, and we can define first of all the so-called M2M center, which in today's market perhaps represents the most significant portion of IoT. So whether we're talking about the consumer or the enterprise side of M2M here, these devices, we would say, I mean, there's a particular definition here: sufficient individual value to justify the embedding of, discreetly paid for point-to-point or subscription-based connectivity. But I think the important word here is maybe connectivity. I mean, for the most part, that's really what we'd be paying for. We might pay for the end device, of course, but we might be paying our communication service providers on some subscription basis to provide us with that connectivity. And that may be offered on it could be on a wide area basis, a local area basis, using technologies. Well, today, really using technologies like GSM. GSM is a bit of a sticking factor in the whole machine-to-machine, because a lot of the current machine-to-machine end devices are still connected via GPRS. So really, we've got to move that on a little bit, and maybe 5G is a little bit too far away for that translation. But there's a lot of emerging, or perhaps well-established is a little bit too not accurate for the time being. But there are emerging 4G or LTE-based technologies that may replace the current 2G crop of devices and services. They tend to be, certainly on the enterprise side, high-value endpoint assets. So we're looking at sort of industrial-style equipment here. High-value, high-reliability devices, mostly industrial equipment, as I say. And these they could be wide area attached, or they could be remote sensors, or they could be attached via some kind of gateway or hub in those sensors. And perhaps again more on the enterprise side, defined by typical B2B or B2B2C models, at least for the time being. But it's not we've drawn a split, a kind of a fairly sort of rigid dividing there between the consumer and the enterprise, but it's not always as clear cut as that. I mean, just a couple of examples at the bottom here, for example, like AT&T Digital Life Smart product, is actually enabled by this Jasper licensed connectivity management platform. So we may be looking at something that appears to be offered to the consumer, but there is some sort of enterprise hardware that sits behind that. And similarly with Vodafone, their simple out-the-box experience, which powers the Amazon series of tablets, actually relies on a service data platform also provided by Vodafone. So there's certainly an enterprise backing, shall we say, to the consumer end product. So we've got that M2M core for the time being, but remember, going out to this sort of 40, 50 billion connected things, then certainly on the consumer IoT and the enterprise IoT, there is a much bigger market surrounding that, which we could refer to as this sort of IoT halo. It's what is being referred to in the Ovum reports. So we would say, predominantly LAN attached, maybe low value endpoints, so a lot of consumer electronics, certainly maybe on the enterprise side, sensor data collection, but maybe there's, we're saying here, insufficiently valuable, so not valuable enough, maybe for people to be paying for point-to-point connectivity. So, where's the service-based model in that? Because a lot of people will expect to buy some end-to-end or some IoT consumer device and expect it to work as sold to them, so not having to pay in addition for connectivity and so on. And that's quite a difficult market to break out of and to break into these new markets. So on the consumer side, we could say pretty clearly it's it's about the consumer electronics, the wearables, the kitchen gadgets, and so on. That we often talk about. And as I say, smartphone connected, maybe no direct operator connectivity. So the devices, the smartwatches, the wearables, and so on that we buy these days, we probably don't really think about, are they LTE connected? Do they require some, local or personal area network type connectivity? And the big question for the operator, of course, is, where's the business model in all of that? Where's the paid for subscription, ongoing revenue streams that you could drive out of such a field? On the enterprise side, maybe, because we're talking here about enterprise IoT, so perhaps in a certain degree similar to consumer devices, but these are the things that would power the smart services. So, smart buildings, smart cities, smart transportation, smart industries. Now, we're saying, I guess, to a degree here, similar to consumer devices in that the cost base has to come down in order for us to gain traction, to get return on investment. The cost of these devices have to be pushed into the sort of the low dollar amounts, really. But that large-scale data collection, that capability that we may develop as operators, may be enough to support some long-term service-based business models. There's clearly some technology differences as well, which we're not really going to get a chance to get into here. But what radio spectrum do we use? Is something we're using local area connections on licensed spectrum, or are we looking at wide area connectivity, perhaps using the licensed spectrum that's currently owned and operated by the operators themselves? That's something that needs to be investigated. Now, clearly, if we're using licensed-based spectrum, there really has to be some sort of ongoing subscription-based model, perhaps, to justify the use of that licensed spectrum. Driving sustainable revenue out of an unlicensed spectrum is a kind of a tricky thing to do, because most of that is tied up really in the end user device itself. And the consumer may give no real thought to the ongoing connectivity requirements that thing has. So, typical Wi-Fi connected device or a Bluetooth connected device, we don't really think about the connectivity requirements from those over and above the basic functionality of that device, whether it's a wearable or a thermostat in your house, or a remote security systems and so on. So there are these clear dividing lines, really, clear, I guess to a certain extent, clear dividing lines between the consumer market, the enterprise market, but also remember, machine to machine perhaps represents really the current market as we see it, and the IoT is a much, much wider market, where in fact we're looking at very, very large scale connectivity. Now, just a little bit on the technology side here. It's not deep in technology here, but there's an interesting a technology stack that we can define here. Now, we're not talking really about a protocol stack as such in that very technical way, but really this IoT technology stack here really is a series of layers that represent the parts of the business to an extent. I mean, this is in a way a value chain for the service. So we've got things like, well, connectivity. I mean, that's a big one, really. I'll say a couple of things about that in a moment or two. But the manner of connectivity, whether we're talking about LTE-based standards or the emerging 5G standards, or those maybe more proprietary standards, of course, we need some sort of first-mile connectivity from the device into the network. And then the network, of course, that will be the typical place where you'd expect to see the communication service providers, the telcos. So I would say there is emerging standards as far as connectivity is concerned. There is already existing network infrastructure, which, to a certain extent, can pretty much do all of the things that we want it to do in connecting the devices and so on. But perhaps what's lacking at the moment is some sophisticated management within the system. Okay, remember this number, this sort of 50 billion things that we keep going on about, and that you'll see quoted everywhere. An operator may expect to have, hundreds of millions of connected things, if not billions of connected things at some point. So how do you manage that? What does the billing platform have to look like for that, or the provisioning system for that? How automated or otherwise might the system be? So I think there's quite a lot of work to do with regard to the management platforms that exist within the system. There's a lot of work to do in that area. And then I think as we move out towards the applications and the devices, perhaps that we're looking towards the companies, the organizations that can specialize in those very specific products, be it smart home type devices or connectivity. So we may be looking at vehicle manufacturers developing, of course, their own, device, or at least integrating their device hardware, creating applications that surround that make it a usable platform for the operators. But each of these layers you could see as being some kind of enabling platform to the layer above. So if you like, the connectivity layer offers connection services to the network infrastructure. The network infrastructure can expose those devices via some platform or management processes and so on. So each layer in its own right is a complicated set of functions, individual functional roles that could be complementary, they could be independent. I'll show you a much more complicated picture in a moment or two. Although we don't really have a chance to dwell on it. But I think this is quite an important picture here for companies operating in and around the IoT space, because really what we need to be able to do is to define what level of involvement will be in the IoT, and to define what the market opportunities are. So we can look quite clearly at this and say, are we a device manufacturer? Therefore, what functions and features do we need to include in the devices? What access do we need in terms of application software? Are we platform providers? In terms of billing, provisioning, consumer management, consumer experience services? Are we quite simply just a connection provider, and we do nothing other than offer straightforward connections to these potential IoT third parties? So when we break that diagram down and look at it in much more detail, you can see straight away on the connectivity side we've got a couple of decisions to make here. And we mentioned before things like local area connectivity versus wide area connectivity. And again, there's some discussion around the idea whether it's sort of a fixed based service or whether it should be a mobile based service. I guess that's one of the things that we should point out really here, that the IoT market isn't necessarily only a cellular market. And certainly not just a mobile market. This may be a slight digression, but when we talk about 5G, for example, 5G is not just about a new mobile standard. It's not like, when we went from 3G to 4G, it was kind of the same thing, but a little bit faster, a bit more efficient and so on. But as we move from 4G to proper 5G, it's a much, much bigger ecosystem that's being defined that includes fixed connectivity and services, as well as public cellular mobility, wide area cellular mobility. And then of course there's that discussion whether we're going to use licensed or unlicensed spectrum, whether we'll make use of standardized technologies, or whether we can make use of some of those emerging proprietary standards in there. And then of course when you get down to it, there's many different potential technologies that you could use just to provide the connection from the device to the network point in some cases. Now, network infrastructure, as I mentioned, we've pretty much got the network infrastructure. There are questions to be asked about whether or not it is sufficiently well integrated and set up to provide connectivity in the order of hundreds of millions. And that's probably points towards this platform, this management layer that we might have in the service. So, device management, application management, connectivity management. So everything to do with provisioning, subscription management, connection management, and so on. There's a lot in that part, and that's probably one of the areas that requires the greatest degree of thought or inspection when it comes to determining whether or not we are ready to support an IoT market. And then of course in the application and in terms of development, business intelligence is an important thing. I'll mention that again in a moment or two. And then you move up towards the hardware. So we're talking here, of course, about the chipsets, the nature of the sensors that we're actually using, the antennas, usual kind of thing. But I think maybe even things like operating systems might be an interesting area. That may depend very much on the kind of device, how consumer facing the device is, or how embedded that device might be within a vehicle or within a sensor array and so on. So it's a fairly complex movie when you zoom into it. And again, you could kind of use this as almost like a value chain model to say, which part of this value chain do we currently occupy, and do we want to branch out of this area? I'll show you in a moment a more traditional value chain, and give you a couple of examples of how operators or how companies are branching out of their siloed positions within those within that value chain. But I thought we'd just say a couple of things about the connectivity options. So again, that bottom layer of the stack, effectively. Now, clearly, the current standard is an LTE 4G based standard. And what we've been doing over the last few years, or the last few releases, really, is it says here, is scaling up in terms of performance and mobility. So, adding more spectrum, things like carrier aggregation and so on, increasing the data rate. We're trying to get to the 1 gig, 3 gigabits per second, and trying to reach out further and further. So LTE, in its current guise, of course, is very good for high capacity, high mobility services. However, when you start incorporating aspects of machine type communications, then we need to run the standards in the opposite direction. So we need to scale down those services in order to manage to manage the price point and the battery life of the devices. Because a lot of these devices, they just need a few hundreds or tens of kilobits per second. So we're seeing some movement, of course, in the LTE world. There's category 0, Cat 1, Cat 0, Cat 1 devices, but also LTE-M, and a little bit later down the line, things like Narrowband IoT services. Now, this is an adaptation of the LTE standards, so there's a little bit of backward compatibility to a degree built into these services. So you could think from a network perspective, all of the base stations and other access points and MMEs and HLRs and such like that we've built into the network. There's a degree of compatibility with this LTE-based standard for IoT communications. Which might give the operators a little bit of traction, a little bit of an easier entry, a lower barrier, effectively, to get into these various markets. So I think when you consider IoT, I think the main metrics here are really that low price point, and longer battery life. That's kind of some of the important metrics that we would consider. And as mentioned, LTE is sort of is adapting to those requirements. What we shouldn't forget, though, is the other sort of more proprietary technologies out there, like LoRa and Sigfox and a few others, that they already offer that similar performance and perhaps have got a bit of a market advantage. In fact, if we look at what those markets look like, both in terms of the live or trialed or those which are planned, you can see in fact that those two technologies, Sigfox and LoRa, they've certainly got a current market advantage in that they have many more deployed services than things like narrowband IoT. However, looking forward, those which are planned, things like narrowband IoT seem to have a greater degree of future traction if we're to believe this particular prediction. So narrowband IoT, LTE for machine type. Just a couple of examples here. In Vodafone, they're launching soon in 4 European markets. The Asian operators tend to favor narrowband IoT. There's a lot of support from Huawei in that respect as well, so that's probably giving them a little bit of traction. In North America, LTE-M or machine type communications, AT&T and Verizon are both conducting trials and planning launches with LTE-M. I mean, the market is a bit more complex than that I'm presenting in these couple of bullet points here, but certainly the operators are looking much more towards the standard technologies because, of course, they've already have a massive LTE base, so it may be an easier point of entry for them to make use of those LTE-based standards. However, we shouldn't dismiss things like LoRa and Sigfox because already, it's a massive market already. I mean, 10 million or so registered devices, a lot of pre-existing, real-life working systems out there as well. So if we come back to that value chain, I mean, this is the more traditional view of a value chain where, if you're a CSP, you tend to put yourself in this particular silo. Okay, so you're a mobile operator, you're a fixed operator, maybe you're an operator of a different kind, but you are predominantly the provider of the connection in the system. Now, given the history of the operators in respect of things like the OTT companies, the over-the-top companies, we need to break out of that mindset a little bit and be more than just the provider of connections for OTT services. So these mobile operators really have to think about a way of breaking out of that silo. But in which direction do we go? That's I think is quite a complex service or a complex question. It seems that what most operators would choose to do, I mean, it seems it seems unlikely that operators will become, network component vendors. I mean, that doesn't seem like a sensible transition at all. But moving from just being a connectivity provider to being a platform vendor, okay, with all of the required agility and flexibility when it comes to dealing with hundreds of millions of connections, seems like a fairly sensible move. Just a couple of examples. We'll kind of map on here some of the operators, vendors, and others that operate in this space. If you take Vodafone, for example, again, we're traditionally a connectivity provider, okay, but the development of their global service data platform or global data service platform, it's actually moving or transitioning towards the platform environment. I remember we talked as well about, I think it was AT&T making use of the Jasper platform as well to support their smart home services. So operators are moving definitely in the direction of being sort of platform providers as well. So in terms of that stack, that technology stack, you can see that the operators want to move vertically within that stack to be in a position to manage and to consider those industry verticals to which they may have to provide service. Also, we've got Sierra Wireless in here as well. I mean, more traditionally known as a kind of a module manufacturer, a hardware manufacturer, but they're also moving towards the platform process and providing device management platforms. So there needs to be movement in here, I think, if there is to be a sustainable long-term business case for these companies that sit in here. So. Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a stretch really to say, where is the market for IoT? I mean, there is the industry verticals. I mean, I think these are fairly well understood these days. Certainly, there are these precise definitions of industry vertical. But we would say an industry vertical, which of course is what we've shown at the top here. So industry verticals. These are the areas of business, if you like. I suppose a more simple way of thinking about this would be that the industry verticals that we're quoting here effectively will be the new business customers that the operators should have. So whether we're talking about business services, education, healthcare, manufacturing, and so on, these potentially are the industry verticals to which we need to be engaging in order to drive these next generation business models. On the application side, the so-called application verticals, which rather confusingly are shown horizontally here, but they are nevertheless verticals. For each of the industry verticals, there is pretty much an infinite possibility in terms of the number of applications that could reside within that industry vertical. So if we're talking about transport as a vertical, okay, well then we can say, well, the applications, well, we could talk about connected cars. There could be fleet logistics services here, point of sale services, security surveillance, and so on. So there's an unimaginably large series of application verticals for each of the industry verticals. Now, if we're in the business of connection provision, so if we're an operator effectively, it may not be our job to try and imagine all of these application verticals. I think that would be too much to ask. I think the individual verticals themselves, so if you're in transportation, if you're a vehicle manufacturer, for example, it's easier for the vehicle manufacturer to think of all of the applications to which for which their customers may be willing to pay. So whether it is whether it's in-vehicle entertainment or vehicle telematics and so on, that's really up to the car vendors to come up with these applications. But they then need to engage with a connectivity provider. So this is why I say the management layer of that stack, okay, that platform process really is the most important part, because we need to be able to expose ourselves in a very, very agile way to any one of these industry verticals, not necessarily to understand the absolute detail or minutiae of everything that they want to do, but we have to provide a platform which is flexible enough to allow them to make use of the connection services in a way which benefits their end users and of course the applications that they're building. Now, from the Ovum analysts, when we plot things like this level of disruption in the market versus certainty of market here, then one of them tends to pop out to the top here, and this is manufacturing. Now let's just flick back to this slide here. So when we look at the manufacturing vertical, you can see that there's a large number of potential application verticals that sit within that as well. So there's a lot of quite compelling reasons in the manufacturing vertical to make use of the Internet of Things. However, there's quite a lot of high barriers to entry, just in terms of the number of devices that you need, the nature of and difference between those devices. But I think in order for it to be a success, we've got to be able to demonstrate, I mean, from an operator perspective, we've got to be able to demonstrate some degree of ROI, some traction in that, in order for it to continue. Now, I think that falls back again on the adherence to standards. I think making use of perhaps the 4G, LTE-M type standards, because there's a much bigger ecosystem. The economies of scale when we adopt the LTE-based standards, and I suppose 5G going forward, that means that the price point and that particular barrier to entry is much lower. But I think as well the provisioning and the partner management platforms have to be extremely agile in that respect as well, in order for us to be able to engage with multiple parties across that manufacturing vertical. So this is one of the Ovum surveys that takes place quite routinely. So quite a big sample size, actually, very nearly 5,000 points of sample, and we're looking at all verticals here, all sub-verticals, all countries, and enterprises of all sizes. But the question basically asking here is, what are the drivers for IoT? So one of those drivers might be to improve operational efficiency. Okay, so again, it's that platform layer, that management layer that really needs to be in place, and part of that platform is likely going to be around about the customer experience management as well. So remember the customers here. I guess there's two classes of customer here, because we started off the session by talking about both the consumer IoT and the enterprise IoT. So to some degree, there may be sort of direct to consumer. Okay, so we're going to create and build our own services direct to the consumer. Maybe that's smart home services, smart home security services. But the definition of customer here as well, from a CSP perspective, the definition of the customer will be the industry vertical. So our customer will be the vehicle manufacturer, the manufacturing industry, the healthcare companies, and so on. So we've got to be able to improve the customer experience on that side as well. The ability to develop new services and to deliver those services rapidly or in an agile fashion as well are also within that sort of top four drivers. Now, on the other side of the coin, I suppose, I mean, what are the barriers to entry for this type of deployment? And the main thing really here seems to be legacy IT architectures. So really from that, I guess we could conclude that the current supporting systems that exist within the network layer are not sufficiently integrated enough to allow that flexibility, that agility of service provision and thinking about the attachment to those industry verticals. Data analytics skills as well. I mean, there's a lot of value in the information that we can, because I mean, if you're going to have hundreds of millions of things connected to a network, then almost any layer within that technology stack, there's a huge amount of information that we can pull out of that. But that's yet another data mine that we perhaps don't yet understand, or don't have the skills yet to make that information valuable, but either to ourselves or to third parties. And security concerns, of course, they're always there. I mean, there are some sort of fairly well publicized IoT security mistakes, I suppose, that have been made recently. You're making use of IoT devices to bring down, DNS and such like. That seems to be happening on a more frequent basis as IoT devices, the smart home and so on, becomes a bit more of a legacy. Lack of robust business case, of course, privacy concerns, and maybe lack of customer interest at the bottom there. So these are the sort of the barriers to entry. But I think that lack of analytic skill and legacy IT architecture, those are the key things. So when we try and wrap that up in terms of how do we monetize IoT, I mean, that literally is the billion-dollar question, I suppose. And there's going to have to be a lot of work done over the next 5 years or so to try and figure out exactly how do we monetize, how do we position ourselves. So there's a few sort of key points here from the Ovum analysts. I mean, this is really in the direction of the CSPs. But this, from a CSP perspective, we've really got to exploit the role that we currently operate in that value chain. I mean, we are a connectivity provider. If you're a CSP, you are a connectivity provider. That's what you do. And already telcos have a great deal of experience in terms of network performance management, to a certain degree, things like analytics, enterprise billing, your quality service, customer experience management. We've been doing that for many, many years, perhaps not to the scale or to the depth that will be required in the IoT markets, but perhaps we have more skill, or the CSPs have more skill in that area than the industry verticals that we've been talking about. What we should also be doing as well, prioritize IoT during that digital transformation process. Now, a lot of operators are already in the process of undertaking some form of digital transformation. Whether that's employing cloud-based services, you're reaching for network function virtualization, employing software-defined network, even restructuring the company from an HR, from a human resources perspective as well. That's all part of the digital transformation. So in that process, we've got to think about what this potential market looks like and give that priority. So those telcos that are already providing to a degree IoT connectivity need to be able to focus their IT systems better to monetize that process. So that's again these legacy IT systems we're saying really perhaps are not in a good position to support that market currently. And invest in improving, I guess the key words here are agility. Okay, agility of revenue management systems, and I think the other word here is we've got cloud in there, but scalability is one. I mean, you may think you're a big operator at the moment if you've got 15, 20, maybe 30 million customers, and most of those customers, 99% of those customers will probably be smartphone, human being customers. But when you want to scale that to supporting hundreds of millions of connections, where most of those connections will be to whatever smart meters, vehicles, and so on, then we need to be able to move in a very rapid way. We've got to have scalability in the system, and maybe adopting cloud-based technologies is one of the mechanisms that we could consider there. But there needs to be a degree of automation in these processes as well, because there's little or no way that you could manually manage hundreds of millions of connections. So there needs to be a high degree of automation throughout the business, I think, and this idea of advanced analytics, I mean, that kind of leads on to the next point as well, which seems a little abstract, but invest in data science to take advantage of that IoT data. I mean, I guess big data is another topic in its own right, which we already understand the problems with, like interpreting these large uncorrelated data sets and actually make meaning of them so that we can drive the business further. I mean, some of the data sets that we might be interested in. I mean, remember we're talking here to the industry third parties, the verticals, the transportation companies, the vehicle companies, healthcare, agriculture, and so on. We've got to be able to maybe feed some of that information back into those companies about the use of the devices, whether it's just pure sensor telemetry, or whether it's about behavioral aspects of the way in which those things are being used. We need to be able to pull that information and deliver it in a valuable way out to those industry verticals. And that makes ourselves, the importance within that value chain. We can increase our importance, our standing within that value chain in an important way. So there's a couple of different ways we can do that. We can either invest in employing our own data scientists directly, or through vendor services. So we've got data scientists as a service model. So again, leveraging that sort of cloud-based feel to the services. So I mean, that's just a very few quick points there about how we might think about monetizing the service, but a lot of it is about investment in IT, okay, improving the agility and scalability of the network, and I think putting IoT at the center of any digital transformation that we're currently undertaking. Now, we're pretty much out of time there, so I know that's a lot to take in such a short period of time. But as I say, should you be interested in anything else that we do, either in the IoT area, or whether we're talking about management or finance or leadership, or whether you're really interested on the technical side, do contact the sales team, or look us up on our web address here, just to get a feel for the scope of courses that we can actually do. And as just as a final point here as well, I'm going to put these slides back up on in the end at the moment. Some of you might be aware of the London Tech Week, and one of the we're running on the 13th, 15th of June, Techcelerate, Internet World of Things, or Internet of Things World Europe. What we can offer here is there's a 20% discount. There's a VIP code there, or you can use this link at the bottom here to get a 20% discount on the passes for that. Now that's just open to those that have attended today's session, so you might want to make a note of those in case you're thinking about attending that particular event. And again, you can find information about the event online by where if you do a search for IoT things or IoT World Europe, you'll be able to find a link to that, or use the link that we've provided right at the bottom here.